Hello and welcome to this new episode of Dean and Ben Talk Tech, which I think we can call the DNA Hot Take episode for sure. As most of you know, probably the Digital Networks Act was published yesterday by the European Commission, all 350 pages of it, with just half as much annexes, if not more. Dean and I have been heavily looking into that since yesterday, but obviously we have not read everything and we do not yet understand the consequences of everything. We maybe never will, but we wanted to basically get the conversation going today with the first few things that really jumped at us. Maybe as a quick intro, Dean, what's the overall view from your side?
Right, so the overall framing, and I've sort of went through a fair bit of the leaked draft last week, as well as watching the press conference that Virkunnen had yesterday. Yesterday was 21st of January, if you're watching this later. And there's a couple of things that jumped out. The first is, and we'll talk about this later, the overall thing is framed around things like sovereignty, and we'll talk about that more in a while. But the thing which I've noticed is that it stays in its lane more than the original white paper and the Draghi and letter reports from last year, which were very, very heavy on convergence of cloud and communications and using words like continuum. There was very heavy emphasis in those on sort of specific approaches to dealing with this sort of view that the world of everything from cloud and AI and IoT was converging with telecoms. And instead, this is very much more telecom specific. And whilst there are references to other parts of the technology sector, I think this is a way to avoid stepping on all of the other European Commission initiatives around cloud, AI, semiconductors, big infrastructure projects, these sort of things, which I had previously been concerned that they would all be pulling in different directions. And to me, it looks like DNA has swerved it.
Yeah, and in a sense, it means that this part, at least the simplification agenda, kind of did its job, and they said, okay, let's not overlap with loads of other stuff that we've already regulated on. I agree with you that there are some maybe marginal points where this is questionable, but by and large, I was reassured to see that this is a lot more focused on. Basically, this is a piece of regulation that addresses telecom primarily. Interestingly, and this is also a kind of continuity element, that there were also a lot of hints that this was going to be a major rehaul, if not an entire, throw everything off the table piece of regulation on, or deregulation, in fact, on access conditions. And it seems that this is not the case. Again, I'll have to spend a whole lot more time to see where the subtle changes and differences may be, but certainly it doesn't look like the revolutionary stuff that was hinted at in the white paper, and particularly in the July consultation.
I think in a way that there's a bit of a pivot here to away from sort of over focusing on the access part of networks towards the other stuff. We'll talk about interconnect, we'll talk about satellite a bit, and that there's a recognition I get when I speak to some people that a lot of the big lift of access network upgrades is done, whether that's fiber, whether that's mobile and 5G, and we're sort of filling in the gaps. I think there's still quite a lot on the competition side that we need to watch out for. But I noticed that the DNA text I saw yesterday, it seemed to suggest that most of the consumer protection things, which is very access oriented, seems to be working quite well, and a lot more was focused on other aspects. Particularly, Spectrum is probably the biggest change. I've got more on that, but Ben, any thoughts you've got?
No, I think I agree with you. I think there is a there's a willingness to embrace a form of stability, which some may think is not entirely in line with the innovation agenda. But there is also some sense in saying, actually, the market structure we've got is kind of working. Let's not rock the boat. So yeah, I mean, spectrum is definitely one area where there seems to be ambitions beyond the current, somewhat fragmented, if we're honest, way the European market works. Can you say a bit more about that?
There's two big things. The first is around the governance and the shifting of what was the, if you like, the expert scoop RSPG to becoming part of BEREC and being renamed as RSPB, the Radio Spectrum Policy Body, and becoming a bit less technically focused and more politically focused, and that may have some ramifications in the way in which the EU deals with spectrum management at pan-European levels like CEPT, which is 44 countries, and then on to ITU with things like World Radio Congress at the end of 2027. So I think that's one to watch. But I think the headline grab on Spectrum was this thing around, it wasn't like full harmonisation of all spectrum policy. It was a greater role for Brussels in potentially vetoing specific spectrum auctions for mobile and how they're run and details, but also the shifting to essentially indefinite licensing. At the moment, for most, this is for mobile spectrum for 5G and future 6G, most licenses have like a minimum of 15 to 20 years, which are typically extensible, and in reality usually are, sometimes with extra conditions. And what this essentially does is it changes those to a presumption of indefinite licenses, which is closer to the US model of how spectrum is run. And yeah, to some extent, you could argue, is that going to make any differences? Well, in terms of operationally, probably not. It makes it a little bit harder for new entrants, but you don't get new entrants generally when spectrum license terms are up for renewal. They tend to be rolled over with perhaps additional or different coverage commitments. And ongoing license or ongoing sort of licensing fees. So this makes it more certain and therefore more investable. So I think actually that's from an investor point of view, a good thing, and from a CAO level, C level view in the mobile operators is a positive. Does it change much in the real world? I'm not sure it does. And I think that the quid pro quo on that, interestingly, is more emphasis on what they call use it or share it, or use it or lose it. Now here, there is all sorts of interesting potential scope for avoidance of what's called hoarding of spectrum. So you could say that if you've got an empty part of the country and spectrum with a license on it is not being used, there's now going to be more mechanisms for third parties to say, well, they're not using it, can we use it instead? Which is something which happens to a limited degree in the UK with what are called shared access licenses and local access licenses, local access in particular. Now the question is, Denmark's also had something like that, but everyone said it was more like a paper tiger. And the way they'd structured it, there was no real teeth to it. So I'm very curious to see if that gets implemented properly, because potentially that allows more third-party use by, it could be neutral hosts, it could be other models. And I did see some other things in there about more of an emphasis on, again, filling in the gaps in coverage. And so there's a lot more discussion on things like passive infrastructure sharing, but also active infrastructure and even spectrum sharing, which is a real positive for the neutral hosts of different sorts. National roaming gets a reference as a in extremis mechanism, or localized licenses. So I think all of those are quite good. And they also, another part of this was more of a recognition of, well, Wi-Fi, but it's actually called RLAN in regulator speak, Radio Local Area Network. It also includes things like Bluetooth and other stuff. As a bit more of a first-class citizen. And there's some stuff there about you should be allowed to share and aggregate Wi-Fi networks as long as it doesn't contravene your terms and conditions. And that, to me, is at the very least a little bit of a recognition that this stuff is important, which I've previously criticised the Commission for not having a Wi-Fi strategy, but I'll take RLAN as a good substitute, and it's a decent starting point.
It'd be interesting to see if that feeds into the whole whole debate around 6 gigahertz, which we discussed on a previous show and hasn't really landed anywhere. But certainly, at least that recognition is meaningful, and it also, what you're saying kind of explains why GSMA seemed to be a bit pissed off yesterday about
Yeah, I mean,
this.
so I think they were happy about the indefinite licenses. That said, you have to be careful here about, there's nothing that, whilst it talks about 6G, it hasn't defined future, what when 5G were called pioneer bands. But it does say that there could be an implementing act. So we might find that RSPG or RSPB and BEREC come up with a 6G strategy roadmap. And in fact, that's referenced as being unlikely. So we may well find that there is an implementing act around 6G. And that is where all the debates around 6 gigahertz will come up, maybe 7 gigahertz, depending on what gets determined at WRC, and so I think that's also where the BEREC versus CEPT fights might occur as well, and it also for 6G strategy, it will also potentially impact satellites, and there's a lot in there about satellite. Although I have to say I haven't delved into it in a huge amount of detail, and what that implies. The main thing to say on satellite is passporting and pan-European authorization for satellite services is really important, because it means that if you want to offer, say, pan-European direct-to-device as part of 5G and 6G, you don't need to get permission in 27 countries and then do coordination with everywhere else. That's a big win for so Vodafone's got a partnership with AST Space Mobile. I know in the US, T-Mobile with Starlink, and that may read across to Europe. I think the mapping between the US satellite constellations and Europe is going to be an interesting one to watch, as well as how this impacts European constellations, particularly IRIS², which is the strategic one.
Yeah.
But anyway, there's more to come on satellite and also spectrum generally. There's a lot to unpick, and what the timelines are on formation of this RSPB rather than RSPG, whether we get to the 6G strategy before or after World Radio Congress in 27. The timing on that is going to be an interesting one to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that's not directly related to this, but that I looked at a little bit more in depth, was copper switch off, because the Commission had been very vocal prior to the publication on them wanting to be, to provide tools for acceleration of copper switch off. And in fact, the recitals seem to, give a lot of importance to copper switch off as a key switch for the European ecosystem into better digital services. In practice, though, the tools that are suggested here, or that the Commission would like to see implemented, I'm not sure are going to change very much in the dynamics of things. So essentially, they were hard-pressed to put a cutoff date, which a lot of people anticipated should be 2030. They have put a cutoff date, but it's 2035, so that's 10 years away. Also, they basically formalize copper switch-off planning. So basically regulators have to submit a switch-off plan by 2029, which forces them to figure out zoning and stuff like this. And it's not uninteresting, but it's not, I don't think it's an accelerator. It's just a stabilizer in a way. So unless the perspective was already that it was going to be 2040 or 2045, then I don't see much acceleration. And what this comes down to at core is, can you switch the copper off? And so one of the things that I found interesting in there is that without addressing the question of coverage targets that are part of the Digital Decade program, basically the Commission says a copper switch off area can be switched off from 95% of alternative coverage on. Incidentally, I did note something that struck me, which is that they didn't mention VHCN, which was the preferred terminology for fiber and cable that delivers a gigabit, they actually mention explicitly that the alternative should be FTTH. So that's something I'm going to have to dig into, because that would actually be quite momentous if it looks like they're dropping cable as a good alternative source. I'd be very surprised if that was the case, but maybe it's just a question of wording. So, long story short, if the Commission says 95% is the threshold after which you can initiate switch off, well, effectively, that means that the 100% target is good to have, but not vital in order to move forward. And I think that's, even if it's not an official stance, it's an important step in recognizing, like, there's a principle of reality that seems to reassess itself to a certain extent.
Yeah, I think this. Correct me if I'm wrong. There's also something which on the access regulation will make it that you can have localized SMP or something like that, which is positive and negative for altnets.
Yeah, so that was already the case, and in fact, there are some markets like Sweden and Denmark where you have effectively, 50 or 75 market reviews. I think that's actually very cumbersome and unwieldy. I understand the rationale. I'm not sure that it's necessarily a good thing. I'd have to look into the wording exactly to see if there's anything new there. But certainly that was how certain market functioned. Like, I know Sweden and Denmark are the big examples of this being implemented en masse, as it were.
I mean, my take with the copper switch off is there's reality creeping in. Yeah, there's no way that everywhere is going to have all fibre in 5 years' time, even with a pretty much unlimited bucket of money. There's still going to be issues of everything from I don't know how you change the railway points, which might depend on copper cabling, to all sorts of legacy stuff, which is a real pain to unwind. And I think that there's also been some pushback in some countries as well.
Yeah, just to be clear though, if you look at how this was done in Spain and in France, the principle of reality also says just because there was copper doesn't necessarily mean there has to be fiber. So a lot of the stuff that was handled through copper historically is going to switch over to wireless or IoT or combinations thereof. There's a... I think the important thing here is if this actually helps to stir the ecosystem in motion in the various countries to actually start looking into this in depth, then solutions will be found. And Spain shows that it's not rocket science and it's not that complicated. That's a small positive, I would say. I still think that the bit that was not really addressed in there is there's a lot about consumer protection, so people need to have an access service, etc. There's not a lot about competition protection, and we know that copper switch off is a golden opportunity for incumbents to regain market share and consolidate monopoly positions where they have them. And I think one of the big challenges, and this is what we see in the UK, for example, outside the EU, obviously, but is that if you just let the incumbent do whatever they want, they're gonna focus on tactical switch off where it benefits them, and they're going to keep the copper plant going where they don't offer alternative network services. So, yeah, it's good that it's in there. I don't think it's revolutionary. As a summary, I think that's what we can say. So obviously, the big
IP
one
Interconnect.
and the one that's going to be exactly the one that's going to be discussed, I think, the most is IP Interconnect. So what's your take on it?
Well, two things. First off, it's very much a focus on IP Interconnect as a contentious rather than network access fees. And so I think that we're talking here about this really fractious discussion we started having over the last 9 months about the possibility of dispute resolution and regulating IP Interconnect. Essentially, the back of fixed and mobile networks where they intersect with the internet, and peering, and CDNs, and content and cloud companies. That was the nexus of a lot of the discussion before, and frankly, what's come out yesterday has raised at least as many questions as it answers. At one level, it sort of tries to be all things to all people. It doesn't go for the nuclear option of network fees or binding arbitration, but there's a lot of wiggle room, and you could argue slippery slopes.
Yeah, so I think I was trying to figure out what the Commission's intent was there, and I'm not sure that I know. That one way of looking at this is to say, so what's in there is this conciliation notion of conciliation, which is not arbitration, it's non-binding, but at the same time there's a very detailed process for this conciliation in the articles, which is a little bit weird, because if you're going to put in something that says, okay, if people disagree, you should host them over a coffee and have them talk and see if there's a quiet way of resolving that. It's weird that you put in a super detailed process around it. So the paranoid way of looking at it, and I'm not sure it's that paranoid, to be honest. The paranoid way of looking at it is the intent for the Commission is for parliamentaries to look into this and say, well, if this is non-binding, it's useless, let's make it binding. And all you have to do is add a mandatory adjective here and there in the wording, and that's what you get. The other way of looking at this, the more positive way of looking at this, is the Commission knows this will not fly, and it's a nod to the Connect Europes of this world and saying, well, we went as far as we can. Sorry. I lean towards the first option, unfortunately. I actually think that there is some hope that this is going to be strengthened in parliamentary discussions. And this is, by the way, a lot tougher, because the people you have to convince that this is a bad idea are the people who do not understand how the internet works at all. So you're kind of starting from scratch, and that's really tough. The other thing
there's a little bit.
Yeah,
I was going to say there's a bit. Some of the phrase tries to exclude CDNs and some content companies from the arbitration process, but there's other bits which suggest it's inside.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
It seems to be a bit contradictory.
There's a lot of question marks about the wording and what it implies, especially if you fold in the recitals. There seems to be things that are internally at odds within the document. The other thing that strikes me is that the entire wording of that article, which is it 91? I've got it here. 191, sorry. The ecosystem cooperation. The whole wording of that article seems to imply that currently peering is not negotiated in good faith, and that the conciliation thing is a way to make that happen. But actually, BEREC said very explicitly this is a functioning market. As you said, if we focus on interconnection especially, this is a functioning market. And so it's weird that the wording should presume that it is not a functioning market. And my concern is that this is the worldview that parliamentaries are going to take with them as they get into that discussion because of the way this is worded.
I think you could be right. I mean, a lot of it also is going to come down, though, to the makeup of whatever BEREC turns into and their attitude. And if they're coming... because you could argue that BEREC does a really good job in shining a bright light on questionable practices. Yeah. And actually... if essentially the BEREC turns up to a meeting and goes, hang on a sec, that looks unreasonable, no one else does that, why are you doing this? Then that's reasonable, I guess. The danger, as you say, is that the existing wording gets clarified, I say, in a way which becomes, worse, frankly. I mean, there's some weird phrasing like, benefits arising from increased traffic. Well, that implies that firstly the traffic's going to increase, and that the benefit arises from the increased traffic, whatever that means. What happens if traffic stays the same? I mean, does that mean that any benefits from static traffic don't get shared, or whatever the phrase? And if traffic goes down, or if there are losses rather than benefits, do you share those? It's
But
very
also,
vague.
I mean, how do you define sharing the benefits of
Traffic.
traffic? I mean, does that mean the telcos have to start paying on the other end because they're benefiting from traffic?
I mean, there's all
Yeah,
sorts of things. I mean, I mean, benefits from increased traffic. You could argue that if there's a move away from all you can eat back to tiered pricing, well, the benefit from increased traffic
exactly.
flows to the operators.
Yeah. So no, I agree. I think that's an issue. Going back to one point you made, which I think is crucially important, though, is I think until now, BEREC has been a very reasonable voice in this whole debate. And it is, to some extent, a little bit paradoxical that the Commission should turn to BEREC to basically be the voice of reason on this if they think there is a problem, which BEREC doesn't seem to think. However, at the same time, the DNA has some elements of transformation of BEREC, which are very hard to anticipate. And to be honest, that's not a part of the document that I've pored over in depth. So I'm not sure I understand what the Commission's intent are and what BEREC might look like down the line. But I think that points me to actually, I still think this is a bad idea, whether BEREC stays the same or changes, because fundamentally there is no rationale for this being identified as a market failure.
And to be honest, Virkunnen said that. Yeah, that it generally works very well in her speech yesterday. So it could just be that a lot of this is almost like ducking what's the most contentious issue and punting it either to Parliament in terms of timing to avoid. Yeah, frankly, this was the thing that was most likely to cause a blow up with the US. Given the timing of this DNA coming out the day of Davos and with all the Greenland stuff going on. So to some extent, yeah, this is almost like punting that to a later decision cycle.
Yeah,
Or
possibly.
it could just be the Commission punting it to BEREC and saying, well, if BEREC says it's good, then it's all good. So stop complaining.
Yeah.
So you can look at it in a rose tinted way as well if you want to. But
You could,
I'm sceptical.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I am too.
As
All right.
always. Yeah.
So hey, we have 2.5 minutes to wrap this up. So these are the three big points where we see some potential changes, and certainly some areas for discussion. But more broadly, there's a few takeaways that I think are interesting to look into. One of them you mentioned is that sovereignty seems to be, at the very least, sparkled across this whole thing. In practice, it's a little bit hard to see how it changes.
I think
things.
I think satellite is probably the area where it'll crop up most, and I think the other bits of sovereignty will crop up in the cloud and AI discussions elsewhere in Brussels. But I'd say that from a telecoms point of view, and I haven't looked in the white paper and others, there were and the call for evidence was a lot about subsea cables. I haven't looked to see if that's in there as well. I suspect that those are going to be the sovereignty focus points, not so much about vendor and supply chains and so on. There was something on cybersecurity and high risk vendors, a separate document. So I think that the main surface is going to be satellite in particular, but I need to go through it and unpick what this means. As a bit of a shameless plug, I'm going to be running my next Unthinkable Lab workshop with Andrew Collinson in April on sovereignty and resilience.
Good
it's
topic.
definitely something I need to get on top of.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other thing which you pointed to me, but looking back, I think is interesting as well, is that there are mentions here and there of demand being the key driver, and if demand is not there, then what can the Commission do? And I think this is to some extent new, because it seemed like the previous approaches of the Commission were very supply driven, and I think this is actually a welcome change to some extent. I mean, obviously it's not front and center, but it is in there. And maybe as a general conclusion, this notion that there is a bit of a reality check going on is welcome. What do you think?
There was a specific mention on 5G and spectrum, and in the impact assessment, and it's limited regulatory predictability, that spectrum, and lack of demand affect financial attractiveness of high quality 5G deployment projects to investors. And that little phrase of lack of demand, and also I looked at when it was talking about traffic and traffic growth, there was a term in the draft that I saw leaked, which was traffic has been growing, without any reference to and is forecast to continue.
Yeah.
So I think there's a bit of a recognition that demand is not happening, and on the mobile side, and I think probably also on the fixed broadband and fibre side as well. And I would very much like to see more emphasis on demand side as well as supply. There's a demand gap rather than supply or investment gap.
Absolutely. So,
great.
As we said at the start, this is by far not the last time we discussed this. These are our hot takes, but really they're conversation starters, and we'd be very keen to hear whatever our listeners think about this, and please comment either on YouTube or on LinkedIn where we're going to share this, because we think this is just the start of the conversation. The regulatory process, the parliamentary process is now going to take quite a while to get to a conclusive text. It's important that voices be heard, and that means for us it's important that the debate needs to happen.
Absolutely, and there's all sorts of stuff we haven't really had time to talk about. I mean, more depth on satellite. There's some stuff on numbering which I need to look at some point, and sort of follow up with people on the spectrum side of it. But overall, this is a quick take. There's a huge amount in there, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it for a while. There's also a connectivity conference in Brussels, I know, in the middle of February, which would probably have a few more answers. I should be at that. But for now, I think hopefully this has given everyone another set of takes. There's going to be no shortage of takes, but hopefully ours are useful as well. There's a couple of nuggets in here you hadn't heard before.
Absolutely. And just so that it doesn't become your phrase, I'm going to be the one to say hit like and subscribe, and speak to you soon.
Cheers. Thanks.